Michael and I started in the paint trade in Oakville. We became really quite frustrated by the poor performance of the material. There were a lot of health concerns that we had, and of course environmental concerns with these materials. After having gone through that experience, we actually come to really hate paint, which is funny now that we've kind of come full circle on it. So as a response to that, we opened the store Living Rooms in an attempt to try and bring those materials to the market that we felt were pretty difficult to find at that time. And even after having done that, we still were never really able to find an exterior finish that solved these main problems, that being the performance, the human health and environmental health. And so we started to look beyond North America and into the European marketplace, and we started to find some interesting things. So one of the things that's interesting on a lot of buildings in Europe, old buildings, is that peeling paint is a lot less common than it is here. That kind of got us intrigued. So we started to set about finding the best European alternatives. And that's ultimately how we ended up finding Albec linseed oil paint producer in Sweden, and also some other finishing producers, predominantly from Sweden, funnily enough. The Scandinavian marketplace is a lot like Canada in a sense that we need to solve the same kinds of problems. We have similar environmental climates. We are timber producing and timber loving cultures. And what we'll start to talk about in the presentation is that the Scandinavians have, over the past 30 or 40 years, been trying to find their way back. And we're starting to do this now. But one of the common things that we hear a lot is that it's given us the chance to use wood again as a viable building material outside. As a wood-loving people, we get kind of emotional about that. I do a little bit. So this kind of formed our trajectory and our research in our own way, and our business and our life as we try to figure out, I think as everybody here is trying to do, how we kind of harmonize all of those things to live and work in a way that's kind of more aligned with our values and so on. The funny thing about this is that as we've gotten involved with these material producers in Europe, we've found a lot of uptick in the heritage restoration industry. So we do a lot of work now with various levels of government. Parks Canada, I think, is probably one of our single biggest clients, and they're using linseed oil-based materials, finishes particularly, on all of their projects now. This is kind of something that they're rolling out on an ongoing basis. But funnily enough, their attention for these materials is for function, for authenticity on a heritage property, and for economy, as they look at the cost of managing these properties into the future and choosing materials that are going to help them to manage those costs in a better way. So we kind of found ourselves now, having started the store that's very sort of health and ecology focused with natural building materials, and also dipping our toes into this kind of heritage restoration world. We find ourselves in the middle of these two groups, where, funnily enough, there are two groups that use the same materials. Old buildings were always ever built out of natural materials, because that's all they had, and it predates chemistry, a lot of these structures. But there are two groups that don't typically cross-pollinate together. So we sort of see ourselves now as acting as kind of a Trojan horse going into the heritage industry with these materials that satisfy their needs for function, for authenticity, for cost effectiveness, but we also bring this message of ecology and of health with us along with that. If there was a theme that we could try to put around our experience over the years of going through the future of, it's that found in the past. There is a long history in Europe, in various parts of Europe, for using paint as a sacrificial layer to protect all kinds of different substrates, and there's different kinds of paints that do different kinds of things depending on those substrates. And we now have more recent experience to compare to, and we can look and see which ones have functioned better over time. So that's been a great thing. We don't necessarily need to rely on lab testing and complicated data collection like that. We can, in a lot of cases, just look in the past, look at hundreds or maybe even thousands of years of trial and error, as opposed to accelerated lab testing that happens over a few hours or a couple of days or whatever, in order to inform our decisions about which kinds of finishing materials might be best to choose. Our focus largely is on the exterior, but the great thing about pure natural materials that are treated in the right way is that they can be used in both contexts. So one of the big questions that we got to asking once we got into this a little bit was, well, geez, the paint companies are coming out with these new products all the time. And they keep telling us that they're getting better, but the life expectancy of these materials keeps getting shorter. The toxicity seems to be increasing all the time. So are we actually making progress, or are we going backwards? And again, I think we can look at our historical record to inform us on that. So this, as people operating in the paint trade, mostly on the sort of historical building stock in Oakville, Ontario, where we're from, this sort of story was pretty common, where even pretty good modern wooden windows treated with, I would say, the wrong kinds of finishes were failing at a much faster rate than even much older windows, probably carpenter's windows from the past that may not have even been taken care of very well. We're still in much better shape. Any of you who've worked on old buildings have probably found similar stories as well. This was an example of a project in Sweden that the Albec people found years ago when they started their work in the early 80s, where on the same building they had some windows that had been replaced in the 1960s and some windows that had never been replaced. They were the original carpenter's windows from 1910. And SP Fönster is still a window producer in Sweden. They're meant to be one of the better ones in that country, and even producing a wooden window in this case. But for some reason, the old carpenter's windows were lasting a lot longer. So it begs the question, why is that? In an example much closer to home, this is at the Grosse Ile National Historic Site, which is about an hour up the St. Lawrence from Quebec City. It's kind of like Canada's Staten Island, where all of the people immigrating to Canada would have come. They would have been dumped onto this island. They would have hosed them down, and then when they were satisfied that they were germ-free, they could enter the country. So it's now a National Historic Site. There's piles of buildings. They have a terrible time maintaining these buildings because, as I said, the materials are getting worse and they get hammered by environmental conditions in the middle of the St. Lawrence. So this was an east face of a building on the east side of the island, which gets, I think, the worst of the environmental conditions. And they re-sided this building with new select pine and finished it with what they thought was a very good quality water-based exterior paint, acrylic paint. They completed that work in the summer of 2015. I visited the site in the fall of 2016, so a year later. This kind of paint failure was already starting to happen at that point, and we visited again when this photo was taken in the fall of 2017. Hans and Sonia Albec were invited by the National Trust to come and speak at the National Heritage Conference that year. We made a trip out to Grosse Ile. This kind of complete wood failure was happening. That's after 2 years.
Is that rot or just?
It's total rot. Yeah, after 2 years. So there's a number of things going on here. There's woods that are being produced with not very much resin because the modern finishes that we have today can't deal with resinous wood. So that's one problem. Basically a plastic film painted on the outside of the building, and as micro cracks start to occur, and especially at a site like this where, as I said, it's getting hammered a lot by environmental conditions, moisture infiltrates behind the plastic and then starts to rot out the material from behind. This is a drastic case, but maybe only a slightly longer timeline, we might see the same kinds of results almost anywhere, particularly in our climate zone. So, it kind of had us coming back to the drawing board a little bit to really review, what's going on here and what is paint, in fact. So all paint basically consists of some basic components. There's a binding agent of some description. In the case of linseed oil paint, the linseed oil is the binder. As it oxidizes, it becomes firm and binds pigment to the surface and so on. It could be various forms of plastic in the case of modern water-based paints. As Chris said earlier, funny thing, latex paint doesn't actually contain latex. And in what we call good old oil paint is actually modern oil paint, which is petroleum oil paint with alkyd resin in it, which is basically a resin. It's derived from plants, but I guess that's the sort of closest link to nature that you might be able to make there, which is essentially a hardener for that, because petroleum oil or mineral oil or so on its own is not a strong oil like linseed oil or boiled linseed oil or maybe tung oil. So it needs that hardener in order to be able to function and form a skin and offer some level of protection. So there's also pigments. They could be dry earth pigments. They could be synthetic that come out of a tinting carousel that you often see at the paint stores. Different kinds of pigments have different kinds of resistance to UV, and so choosing ones, especially for outdoors, is especially important. There's usually all kinds of other fillers added to paint that give it the bulk and that allow it to hide and cover and so on. And then, extra additives, solvents, biocides, heavy metal dryers, and so on and so on. So by and large, when you look at any kind of paint, it generally has this kind of material mix. And it's useful to be able to kind of pick that apart. The other thing that I think is an important question to ask is, what is to be painted and why? And this, as your jumping off point, I think is an important question to ask because it'll help you to choose the right paint for the right job. So modern paints now will have us believe, or have us sort of come to the understanding that one material can satisfy most situations or all situations. But in fact, it's not really the case. So is it paint for decoration in order to beautify building spaces? Is it meant to be for preservation? Is it meant to be used as a kind of a sacrificial wear layer to protect a surface? Are we painting outside? Are we painting inside? These are all questions that one has to ask in order to get the best material for the job. Another thing to look at alongside the makeup of a paint is, what are the conditions for rot? And we've identified 4 of them, and I think the thrust of the idea here is that if we can intervene at some point and pull out 1 or even 2 of them, we can slow down or maybe even stop those conditions from happening at all. So choosing a material, especially outside, that can do those things in a meaningful way over the long term is an important thing to think about. So when we talk about preventing rot in wood, the main thrust of the idea, and I think what sets traditional paints apart from modern paints, is this idea of protection either from the inside, in the case of a lot of traditional paints, or from the outside, in the case of a lot of modern paints. There are certain environmental conditions that we can't really do very much about because they're just everywhere all the time. And so instead, we're trying to set up ideal interactions. A paint craftsman is almost more like a matchmaker between the substrate, the finish, and the environment, and finding that harmony there, whatever's involved. So another important lesson, I think, is that old material is not necessarily useless material. And I think, this group probably gets that pretty well. Now we've got this really exciting situation where we're constantly talking about how modern science is catching up to ancient wisdom, and the kind of work that is being done in groups like this and in certain groups in the heritage restoration industry and in academia as well, particularly in Scandinavia. There are efforts in lab testing and R&D and so on that are validating what paint craftsmen knew for hundreds of years. And in the case of Scandinavia, again, they've been using linseed oil in particular since the 1600s to preserve wood, and they've been having pretty good results about that. At a certain point, linseed oil became a pretty ubiquitous oil up until World War II. It was basically the oil of choice for not only paint, I would hesitate to say all, but I would say most paints, but also a pile of other products. We'll show that a little bit later on. Even back further into history from that, people might have used whatever binding agents would have been locally available. If they were maritime dwellers, they would have used fish oil. If they were inland dwellers, they might have used protein from wheat flour or rye flour. Or my wife's family's from Morocco, and apparently her great-grandfather was a painter in Morocco and used protein from eggs as the binder for making his paint, and used it as an exterior paint, apparently, in that country. So at a certain point, however, after hundreds of years of trial and error, linseed oil became the dominant oil of choice for making paint. And now, because we can dig into that a little bit deeper in a way that they couldn't do in the past, we can validate that, and we find that linseed oil has an ideal fatty acid composition for wood preservation. So that plays a big part in this whole thing. The other thing that I started to allude to is the idea of protection from the inside out versus protection from the outside in. And in Norway, Jan Godal is a craftsman and a researcher there. He's measured the molecule size of raw linseed oil and boiled linseed oil. These are kind of aggregated numbers because it depends a little bit on the oil. There's going to be some variance. And also measured the size of, this is again, average pore opening size and that would have been in Baltic pine. But the thrust of the idea can be overlaid onto just about any kind of wood. And that is that the raw and boiled linseed oil can easily penetrate the pore opening of the wood, whereas other modified oils and especially synthetic resins don't do that. These substances all sit on the surface and attempt to protect from the outside in. So Michael and I have tried in our work to really define the terms when we talk about these kinds of materials. And so we've tried to sort of lay down a line between paints and coatings, I think, as a main identifier. And this chart breaks out a little bit about what that is. There's a couple of interesting things to take away from this, and that has to do with the dry matter content. Paint companies always put their dry matter content on their tech sheets or sometimes on their cans. And basically what dry matter content has to do with is how much of the substances in that paint can are being lost to evaporation as it's being applied to the surface and as it's drying on the surface. So modern water-based paints and modern oil-based paints are both paints or coatings that dry by a process of evaporation. Traditional oil paints, linseed oil paint in particular, dries by the process of oxidation, which is a different process entirely. So this is why linseed oil paint has a 100% dry matter content per volume. It's why the paint covers, at around double what other paints do. Basically, every drop of paint that you buy in that can gets applied to the surface and doesn't disappear into the ether. So that was an important differentiation there. And of course, the difference in penetration between the two different kinds, largely being penetration or not. And you can easily test for this by doing a simple test on a piece of paper. Modern coatings, once they're dry, will not leave any evidence of having penetrated in because it doesn't, whereas oils will naturally want to do that. So you can imagine that if you fill the cell structure of a substance, so let's say wood, with oil, there's no room in there for water to get in. It's a reasonably simple idea. So we've kind of come to think on modern paint almost like makeup for your building. It's a way that you can achieve a very nice looking result, and you can usually do that fairly quickly, fairly easily, because the chemistry in paints are designed for that. But in terms of protection, not so sure. Linseed oil paint, however, is almost like pigmented moisturizer for your building. And you can think also about the application in that way and also the ongoing maintenance in that way too. The same way that we care for our skin, we can also be caring for our building elements with this kind of material. As a funny side note, I remember the first time I met Hans Albec in Sweden, it was a bit off-putting because he just turned 75, so I think when I met him, he was around about 70. But he had the hands of a 20-year-old, which was a bit off-putting at that time. I've gotten used to it. So one of the things that we got wondering about was, if linseed oil was so great and it had been so ubiquitous for such a long time, up until this, almost hard stop at World War II, what happened to it? Why did we stop using it? Often we think that we move on to new ideas because they're better than the ideas that we had. And I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case here. So we'll kind of move into that a little bit. The linseed oil industry, the flax industry, was a real going concern in Canada in the past. Canada is still the largest producer of flax in the world, anyway. Most of it is produced for making cake to feed cattle now. But in the past, there were these massive linseed oil production facilities that were taking the flax and breaking it apart and finding uses for all of its constituent parts. And that included paint. Tons of stuff in the past either contained or was made from linseed oil for all kinds of things. Of course, cake for animal feed, that's always around. Linoleum flooring, the lino is linseed oil. There is a company now, a German company, that makes a product called Marmoleum that we sell at the store. They've essentially just revived an old recipe. They've gone back to making linoleum flooring the way they started to do it years ago, made out of linseed oil and wood flour and rosin and so on. Particularly, people in the Maritimes used linseed oil to create oilcloth. They would treat their canvas clothing so that they could be waterproof. Oilcloth canvases, treating ropes and preserving ropes in the maritime context was always done with linseed oil and also with pine tar, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Oilcloth wall hangings. Flax was used to make oakum, flax fiber for making oakum. Funnily enough, that's what caulking used to be. This is original caulking, not the stuff that we buy in a tube now. That's actually caulking. So this would have been used as a gasketing material between the deck boards on ships, used between building openings and window frames and door frames and all kinds of things. It would get pounded in with a caulking iron and a mallet, and then treated with oil in order to form a seal. And the thrust of the idea there was that the wood would expand and tighten up against that oil gasket and give you a watertight seal. And it worked for hundreds of years on wooden ships. The modern term for this now is oakum. We carry that product as well. The stuff that we have is made from jute now, but it was very commonly made from hemp, flax, any of these really robust fibers that, like hemp, for example, was used to make all the lines in sailing ships, big, thick ones for hoisting sails and so on. They were always made from hemp. The sailcloth was made from hemp. And when the lines became too ragged to use for shipping, it was somebody's job, usually some poor woman and child whose husband or father had been in debt for too long or whatever. They would have been forced to basically sit there and pick apart this rope and make oakum in order to work off their father's debt. Anyway, that's a different... I don't want to get into child labor too much here. Yeah.
Is it as laborious to use oakum as it was to, say, iron and bind to the wood?
Was it as laborious?
Is it as laborious now?
Oh.
So that's why we move towards more plastic-based caulking, right?
Possibly, yeah. There's still a lot of cases where it gets used, particularly in the maritime context. There's other contexts too. Plumbing, they use oakum. The concrete industry, which I think is probably the reason why we can still get oakum anyway. They're not making it for us. They use oakum as a gasket between concrete slabs, and they usually treat it with something terrible. So it's that black kind of fibrous material that you see that gets inset between. That a lot of that is made from oakum that's been treated with probably bitumen or something terrible. Not necessarily. I mean, there is in our context. Yeah, it's certainly more laborious than just loading your tube and gooshing it in. But there's other things to consider there too. So we were talking about this at lunch a little bit, just as a bit of a side jog. Modern industrial design is mostly concerned with making products cheaper and making products easier to use, not necessarily making them better or more healthful or whatever the case may be. So this is where we started going down this rabbit hole of how did we get here? This is what we're sort of attempting to pick apart, and what we're finding is that it's not necessarily better. So it might be worth the extra effort in order to use a material like that, and I think that most people in this group kind of found that too. Whether it's in this realm or building a straw bale house is incredibly laborious compared to other types of building, but I think it's worth the effort. So suffice to say, flax was everywhere in life at that time. And even the paint companies of the past recognized the value of good quality linseed oil. And this was such a fascinating thing when we started to dig into the advertising of paints. And I have a bit of a background in advertising, so I found it maybe especially interesting. But advertisers are really concerned with the high selling points. What do they want you to know? And they'll usually not talk about the stuff that they don't want you to know. So what do they think is important? They think that using the best pigments and the purest linseed oil, you can find that, here we go, top left, the text is in there. Good old Benjamin Moore from the 1900s was, I liked this ad a lot, you'll see why in a minute. They talk about, to the consumer, offering greater economy of labor and material. We'll get into that as it pertains to linseed oil paint in general a little bit later. And they talk about the better protective value and results that come from using these kinds of materials. And this is one of the ones that I liked. They talk about the material follows the handling of all articles of genuine merit. And that's the sort of thing that I think if we can start to look at all of our materials this way, what materials are we using that actually have genuine merit, that just sort of stand up as being a good idea all on their own? So this is how paint was marketed before plastic paint. Linseed oil paint was also apparently used to protect battleships, even metal ones. And they talk about the importance of using zinc oxide, which we'll also get into a little bit later for that. The thrust of the idea here was that if the paint was good enough to protect a battleship, it's probably fine for your garden shed. So says the New Jersey Zinc Company. And at around wartime, in fact, linseed oil and flax in general was so important that the government in the United States and in Canada was paying people to grow it, paying people to produce it. Funny that they chose to use paint as the graphical example here. And this is where things kind of take a weird left turn in history, because the Germans during that time in World War II had a different idea, and they had a different strategy as it pertained to the production of flax, because flax obviously was an important raw material everywhere. This is a patent from the patent office in Germany in the late 1930s, where the Nazi government had basically issued an order to the scientists to come up with a new binder for making paint. They essentially needed their crops for growing food for soldiers, not for producing flax to make other products for as a material for other things. And the other thing that they thought would have been a strategic advantage is that synthetic binders can be created any time of year, in a laboratory, anytime, and they're not subject to the whims of nature and seasonal crops and all that sort of stuff. Funnily enough, these kinds of strategic imperatives align very well with the corporate chemical companies today. So I don't know, maybe there's something there. This represents the sort of the birth of modern paint, plastic paint, or modern oil paint to start, and then, on from that. And Chris alluded to this similar thing earlier, the foam insulation essentially being Dow turning a war product into a consumer good. This sort of thing happens all the time, many things, and certainly did with paint. So corporations producing chemicals would have looked at that model and thought, holy crap, that's a really great thing. And so they would have started producing paint and flooding the market. And it's interesting to see at this point a shift in the language of the advertising. What are the kinds of things that they are talking about now? What are the kinds of things that they are leaving out of the discussion? So there's a lot of discussion about paint now being quick drying. I must rush home and paint the dining room because I have guests coming tonight. There was a lot of discussion of the new and amazing colors that could be produced from synthetic pigments, chemical pigments. So all of a sudden, this just became an amazing thing for people in a way that wasn't necessarily possible with natural pigments, especially for exterior use. When you want UV stable pigments, you're kind of limited to a particular range. So it means that brights and fluorescents and that sort of thing are out of the question. The other thing was that there was an argument being made that the paints were easier to use, and certainly, modern paint continues that argument today. The idea that it could be done in one coat. Apparently you can do it sitting down in a cocktail dress with one hand. Yeah, I think these ads kind of speak for themselves, but you get a nice initial result quickly, that it levels out easier, it's less prone to running and splattering and all these sorts of things because modern chemistry can take care of all that for you. Sadly, what it does is it also removes the need for any level of craftsmanship or particular material knowledge, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. That was another unfortunate fallout. Industry sort of took that over and left the craftsman basically just the simple paint applicator. For the first time in history, you could choose the level of sheen for your paint. This was never possible in the past, but it's something that we've come to expect now. It's a question that we get a lot. The other thing was about the brightness of paints. They weren't talking about the color intensity, they were talking about the sheen, that it could get this kind of sparkly finish and that was meant to last for a long time. I think what they're saying is basically true. The paint would probably fail in the sense that it would crack and peel off before the sheen went away. So, I think what they're saying is true. technically. And this one I just love to throw in because it kind of summarizes all of those things into one tidy little snapshot of the American family, where apparently dad is a bumbling buffoon, and the brother is kind of a lazy sort of character who just wants to get out of there, and the sister's thinking about her date. So I like this because it's sort of a comment on what the ideal consumer family looked like at the time, whether it was actually true or not. And apparently modern paint fit right into this motif, which is unfortunate. But it doesn't talk about anywhere in here, there's no discussion of function, of longevity, and so on and so on. And again, the painter as craftsman is not in the discussion. So even today, the lifestyle marketing of paint is predominantly what we see everywhere. There's an overemphasis on color rather than function. And even in the heritage restoration industry, there's a lot of concern about choosing a heritage-appropriate paint that is the right color as opposed to something that will actually protect the substrate and function as a sacrificial layer. And, the other interesting sort of side note to that is that peeling paint, cracking and peeling paint, is a modern phenomenon. Michael and I went to a living museum in Sweden last year, and we noticed that there was peeling paint on the shutters of one of these in situ buildings that they had relocated from somewhere else from some long time ago. And we got a little bit pissed because it was misrepresenting the history, because in fact, in the 1600s, for example, peeling paint would have never happened. So it was actually historically inaccurate at this museum. But I don't mean to be a stickler for detail. But funnily enough, because linseed oil paint has been out of the discussion for long enough, we get these peculiar claims now of modern paints talking about performance. So we've kind of dragged the center in the wrong way. We don't have traditional paint, or linseed oil paint in our case, acting as a kind of an anchor to drag that dialogue back. So what are we, when they say that their paint offers exceptional weathering and durability, and that it's best-in-class performance, and it's a lifetime limited warranty, I say very limited, what are we comparing that to? It feels a bit like we're polishing a turd in a certain sense. The ability to compare that to anything meaningful has been sort of taken out of the dialogue. So this kind of brought us to our entree into Europe and the discovery of the Albec people. And so what we didn't know leading up to this point was that there was this small family of craftsmen who were already sort of asking these questions and finding their way back from the Scandinavian point of view since 1982, and making efforts to sort of, go back to the beginning and kind of chart a better way forward. And luckily in Scandinavia, they had a lot of history that had not yet been lost that they could draw on for this. So this is the young Albec family. They became sick themselves. Hans was a painter. I think he was part of the last sort of hurrah of journeyman painters in Sweden. They have a system there similar to ours where anyone with a paintbrush can essentially call themselves a painter. But he was actually a trained painter and painted for his career. He became sick from exposure to solvents. His wife Sonia became sick. She worked in the textile industry, and from the chemicals being used in textiles, she also became sick. So they went through a pretty hard time where they couldn't work. They had 2 children to feed. They had to sell their house and basically moved into this living museum because it came with accommodation. It was in the countryside, and they brought themselves back in a certain sense. And while they were there essentially recovering, they also started to learn about a lot of the old ways and learn from older people about the older methods of building and renovating and looking after buildings, maintaining buildings, and so on and so on. And so they started to kind of see their way forward again. And so they started this thing in Sweden that has since turned into its own subtrade in Europe called windowcraft, where they started to see the window as a discrete unit, and where the window craftsman is a carpenter, glazier, painter, blacksmith, and builder all in one, which isn't to say that the window craftsman is an expert in all of those things, but knows enough about all of those things to combine them into the discipline of window craft. So he can be an expert in windows by drawing on those crafts that would have been treated as discrete crafts in the past, with their own guilds and everything else. And in doing this, able to sort of push the boundaries of what was technically and financially possible. So in Sweden at this time, they were really on a knife edge about whether or not it made more sense to throw out old windows and replace them with new ones, or whether there was some merit in saving them. And these guys started working in that realm in order to save old windows ultimately. And because they designed their work in that way, they were able to do that work in a way that was competitive with the cost of replacement. And so they kind of turned that relationship on its ear. And fast forward to today, while we were in Sweden, they now have a national window restoration day where the people seemingly, I don't know, we're going to go to this next year, I think. So their whole thing, because they were so poor, a lot of the things that they did came out of necessity, but it involved using simple hand tools. It was cheaper, they could work faster, they could be more flexible. They came up with all kinds of interesting inventions, such as the infrared paint remover. Hans Albec is the original inventor of the infrared paint remover, and he held a patent on that for a number of years worldwide, and eventually it dissolved, and other producers now produce that tool. And we carry one of them. And there were other things. They invented the safe working platform, what they called the safe working platform, which was basically a giant clamp that you basically clamped over the windowsill and that allowed you to work on both sides. You can climb in and climb out. I don't think that was anything that they produced or held a patent on, but they were the first ones to be using it in Sweden. Of course, the infrared paint remover, they became quite famous for this in Sweden at that time, partly because they sued the federal government in Sweden for patent infringement and ultimately got a letter from the king saying, nope, you guys are correct, this can all just go away now. And they became quite famous about that. But beyond that, the invention of that tool has opened up a whole industry now in producing infrared paint removers. There's at least 4 producers that we know of doing that now because of their work.
How effective is it?
Very. Yeah.
So it's more like a heat gun with bubble and you can scrape it off?
Yeah, so the thrust of the idea with infrared is that it heats from the inside out, kind of like a microwave. So it warms the substrate, and that helps to lift away old paint. But it also works at a lower operating temperature, so it's a lot safer. It works below the temperature that would vaporize lead. So with a heat gun, it's a radiant heat that comes from the surface. It's very hot. And it will activate the lead and eventually vaporize it. So that's a big problem. I mean, there are other things that you'll activate in old paint before you get to the vapor point of lead that you should be concerned about and probably should be wearing protection for. But as far as lead vapor goes, you're at least okay in using a tool like this. And for them, it was also one of these necessity things where chemical paint strippers don't interact well with linseed oil paint. And so they needed a way to do paint removal that was quick, efficient, and that could work with the material they wanted to use. So that was an interesting kind of thing. And an interesting takeaway from learning from these guys was that when they came up against a roadblock, they just invented a way around it and then allowed them to keep going. So this is the modern version, basically, of what they did with the infrared paint remover. We carry them at our shop today. So this kind of got them to the point where they started to evaluate the paint themselves. And this was based on their experience, their documentation. In 1982, they did 2 different jobs, and they document everything, and they maintain this documentation. They've got 40 years of documentation of their own projects and all the projects of about 250 of their students in Europe. So their documentation is really, really good. But in this particular case, they were finding that the failure rate of the modern paint, and this is on an interior surface on both cases, was failing too fast. At the time, because they were poor and they needed the work, they offered a 5-year guarantee on their work, which was unusual. Usually it's about a 2-year on paint. But they offered 5 in order to get the work. And they were finding that with this kind of failure rate, they had to come back and do the repair work under guarantee too much. So they couldn't afford it. And they decided at that point that even if it meant being paid, they weren't going to do it anymore. That was their line. It was unhealthy for them. They couldn't stand it. And now they could no longer simply afford it. It essentially threatened their livelihood. So that was their decision at that point to draw the line and say, we will only now be using linseed oil paint. And this was a project done the same year with linseed oil paint. The photo was taken after 9 years, and then the first maintenance was in 2010, so nearly 20 years later. using not their own paint, but it was that delving in deeper that got them into making their own paint. For them, the material has always been about supporting their work. So they needed the best quality to get the best performance, and so on and so on, which is an unusual thing for a product producer, because usually product producers are concerned with creating a thing and plugging it into whatever marketplace they'll find uptick in. But for these guys, it was about producing material to support their work as craftsmen. So they needed paint that would satisfy their needs to do good work. That meant a movement away from paint failure, and toxicity, and finding a solution to the degraded modern linseed oil paints, because there's about a dozen linseed oil paint producers in Europe, most of them in Scandinavia. But these guys really get into the minutiae about oil quality, where it's from, what kind of soil it's being grown in, what's the fatty acid content. They advocate for not using solvents and so on and so on. So for them, that was very important, even compared to other linseed oil paints on the market at that time. And finally, they needed something that could work as a complete finishing system, where all of the materials that they needed to use in combination to get different results could be used together without having any kind of compatibility failures. And it also gave them more predictable outcomes, funnily enough, too. So they started looking into the past. What did linseed oil paint look like before 1938? And these were a lot of the characteristics that they were able to identify for modern use. One of the main things that they became ultra concerned about, and this really is sort of the jumping off point for them for all of their material, is that not all linseed oil is created equal. We even find that now. You can buy linseed oil from the hardware store here, but it's terrible for a number of reasons. And to beware of modern processing. So one of the reasons why linseed oil is now terrible in general. And the big thing that they do is they remove the protein from the oil. So you remove the food source for microbes. Anyone who's used linseed oil recently and the surface has been exposed to the outside has probably found microbial ingress, because there's still a protein source there to eat. And that previous fellow that was referenced, Jan Goodall, talked about how when modern linseed oil is applied to a surface, the oil molecules can absorb in, but the protein molecules can't, so that you also get a concentration of protein on the surface that microbes can then move in on and eat. So this removal of the protein is for them one of the most important things. The other thing is to avoid the use of solvents. Again, they were looking into the past for proof of this too. And this is while painting was still considered to be a craft in that country. They had Handwerkets book is basically like a handwork book or a craftsman's book. These would have been the accumulated craft knowledge that would have been recorded over time, and it would have been updated on a continual basis. And this one is for painting in particular. And they talk about the use of solvents, in particular turpentine at this time, was condemnable as a painter, and that it was mainly used for convenience, and that it could be judged as bad workmanship. Later in the 1950s, this discussion was coming up again in Scandinavia, and again the same kind of message coming from the craftsmen in this discussion, which is that you have to use the highest quality linseed oil you can find. It should be degummed, bleached, cold pressed, and has undergone a lot of procedures to remove all traces of contaminants. In their general context and the way they treat their material, they are ensuring the quality all the way from the field to their factory. They know the fields where the flax is grown in Sweden. They know how it's being produced. We've been to the plant where they actually crush the flax seeds and take the oil out. It's an amazingly clean facility, and most of their flax oil production is going to produce salad oil for the food industry. And of course, the cake gets used for the animal industry, and so on and so on. So they're effectively using a food-grade flax oil to make paint. And then in their own processing and so on in the factory, they're kind of maintaining that quality the whole way along. So we sort of harken back to the use of flax in the past. We can see how it's a material that can contribute to a sort of a collection of more sustainable materials, and also to a kind of circular economy, in the sense that it can basically just be fed back in. There's piles of ways that the material can be used. In Canada, we hope to see a resurgence of that. In their own case, they felt that this one material could meet all of their needs for technical performance, eco-friendliness, beauty, and cost-effectiveness. As we sort of move through this ourselves, one of the things that we get asked a lot is where's the best value? And this is where we get into talking about the cost of a material versus the price. So if you were to take a 3-liter can of linseed oil paint, it costs per volume about double what you might expect to pay for a gallon of modern paint from the paint store. But you factor in that it covers twice as much. The cost per area is about metered out there. But then the life expectancy of the paint is also, when you're talking about total cost, something that you need to take into account. And they're quite confident from their tests and so on that they do that linseed oil paint can have a 20 to 30 year life expectancy if the work is done properly. So the cost over time, especially on big capital projects, like the restoration of the Parliament in Ottawa that's happening now, the main cost of labor and of scaffolding and the millions that get spent on just getting the paint onto the surface can be quite meaningful in terms of the total cost of the project. The other thing to think about there too, which this group probably thinks about a lot, are all of the costs that get downloaded onto other people, whether it's in the form of tax dollars for chemical disposal fees, or there's the environmental cost. Parks Canada has this funny thing. They have to have these crazy catchment systems that cost millions to set up to catch paint so that flakes don't fall into the environment, so on and so on. So they're doing something, but it's costly. Yes, question?
Would the lifespan be increased if there was maintenance to the paint with linseed oil?
Great question. And yes, because linseed oil is both the delivery medium and the binder, you can replace that in a way that you can't do with other materials. So if you were to add water to water-based paint, you would effectively ruin the paint because you dilute out the binding medium as well as the pigments and the fillers and all the rest of it. But with linseed oil paint, you can make a stain out of the paint by just adding more linseed oil to it because it's the binder and the delivery medium. In the case of maintenance on an ongoing basis, as long as the pigments are still in good shape on the surface, then you can just reintroduce that binding medium again. So it's that moisturizer idea.
So 25 years is without maintenance?
Yeah. So really, it's a bit painful, again, on capital projects to have this discussion because governments don't really issue a lot of budgetary money for doing maintenance. One of our colleagues at Parks Canada said that maintenance isn't sexy. Politicians can't get great photo ops for doing maintenance work, but they can do it for restoration work and bigger stuff. So it's not very well funded, but what this type of system can offer you is the ability to maintain the painted surface perhaps indefinitely. It gives off lots of early warning signals. When the surface starts to look dry and chalky, you can get out there with some oil and oil it up, and you can keep that going, essentially forever. So, again, even among other linseed oil paints, this is a comparison of some linseed oil paints in Europe. There's discussion of labeling earlier, hazardous versus not, what kind of solvents get used or not. I'm going to get into this a little bit later on, but Sweden has their own sort of eco-assessments of building materials that are a little bit more closely connected to government in the sense that the construction industry can be mandated a lot more, especially on capital projects, to adhere to these kinds of things in a way that they don't necessarily do here. And even oils that seem, very benign and so on and so on. Albec's argument is that all of these things also affect the quality and the performance. And there's research being done in Sweden now where they are essentially finding that the use of solvents with oil to thin the oil and allow it to penetrate in, and sort of the modern thinking is that the solvent evaporates and the oil kind of reconstitutes itself and goes back to normal, actually isn't true. That you break the molecular structure of the oil up in a way that it doesn't actually reconstitute itself. So you do weaken the oil essentially irreparably by using solvents, and that's kind of Albec's message. Yeah.
Does pigmenting ruin the oil, like changing its color?
No.
And are the pigments themselves in some cases hazardous to the environment?
Some pigments are, yeah. The kinds of pigments that you would find in linseed oil paint. Well, yeah. They're earthen substances themselves, but you wouldn't want to be breathing that in, pigment dust or chalk dust or that sort of thing.
I'm just wondering, would natural dyes have an impact on paint, or is would the paint bind the natural dye to?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it would be fine. Yeah. So performance-wise, no, there's no issue. So in Albec's paint and in most linseed oil paints in general, they're using dry earth pigments is sort of like, I guess, the best way to broadly describe that. A lot of them are iron oxides, but there are some chromium oxides. Their ultramarine blue pigment is made from crushed up lapis lazuli, which is like a gemstone, which is why it costs so much. Yeah, in a certain sense, if you dumped this in the ground, it wouldn't be terribly problematic. The other interesting thing is that in Scandinavia, they have to do these emissions tests on their products. The interesting takeaway here is that this is the acceptable limit in Sweden for short-term exposure to acetone and acrylamide and, in this case, formaldehyde. These are the measured values in Albec's product. And I asked Hans about this a few weeks ago when we were over there because I happen to know that these ingredients are not in their paint, but why did it measure? And he said that basically these are kind of catch-all terms to a certain extent, and that as the paint oxidizes, it registers on those points. So it has to do with the oxidation, basically. I don't really understand very much more about it, but suffice to say, I think the appreciable point here is the difference. And this is for long-term exposure to some of these things, acceptable limit in Sweden versus what's actually found in their paint. So the acceptable limits of things and what the government thinks is okay or the government/industry thinks is okay for us may actually not be, and doesn't necessarily need to be. And so that's, again, why sort of digging into these kinds of things is important. So this is one of the, I'm not going to try to pronounce this, but it's basically a kind of a building material assessment. And what they try to do is measure the effect of the materials on the ecology and on human health and give it a kind of a simple rating so that it can be easy for people to sort of flip through and pick good material. And this is the results of... the same. We just looked in on this recently. It's the same now as it was in 2013. Albec's linseed oil paint is the only linseed oil paint. These are all linseed oil paint producers. It's the only linseed oil paint that gets the green rating from Big Varmedebundumening. I shouldn't have tried that. This is another one that is a bit more accessible. So this BVB is really for the building industry. It's the one that, working on a capital project in Sweden, that they adhere to this system. Construction companies all sort of pay to participate. They're kind of forced. The government makes them do it. Basically, the government says that we want all green arrows on all of our projects, so you figure out what materials you need to use in order to get that result. And so the construction industry is sort of forced to play along, which is a good thing. Synthehus is a similar sort of rating system. They do a kind of an A, B, C, D rating for all kinds of building materials. It's more accessible to the general public, so that there's a way that a person can go in and learn a little bit more. Their website is actually quite good. So again, this is of just linseed oil paint producers, predominantly in Scandinavia, but some others, European, like Oro, for example, is a German one at the bottom there, got a C rating. And what's cool about this one is that you can click in to each of these symbols, and it decodes the symbol, tells you what it's all about, and so on and so on. So Albec's, again, and the two at the top there, their linseed oil paint and their Linus interior wall paint, both A's. The rest of the other linseed oil paint producers are all B, C, and even D. So over the course of their career, after kind of gone through all this with their windowcraft work, with their inventions, with the paint, and so on, they've had the opportunity, as we're having now in Canada, to work on some pretty exceptional projects. This is Holcombe Estate in Norfolk in the United Kingdom, all wood surfaces. I mean, they've been in this process for 20 years, but they're using the linseed oil paint. This is Lord Tom Cook, Lord of the estate. What they found is an interesting thing. He said that their family has been the occupants of this estate for 500 years, and they intend to be there for the next 500. But in Tom Cook's father's time, so in the space of one generation, they had more capital degradation, so more wood rot and wood failure in that one generation than they had in the entire previous 500 years. combined. And they attribute that to the switch to the use of modern paints. So plastic film traps moisture, rots wood, much greater long-term expense. So they're moving back to this. The other interesting piece is that they're also now importing Baltic pine from Sweden, highly resinous wood that's very compatible with linseed oil paint. So they're, in fact, taking that to the next level by using a resinous wood that's already very resistant to rot all by itself, and they're using linseed oil materials to preserve. The Royal Palace in Copenhagen was an interesting case because there was about 1,000 or so windows that had to be restored in essentially record time because there was some royal wedding that was going to happen and the press was going to show up and the windows needed to look good. So, basically what Hans said was that they were getting resistance from craftsmen and contractors in Denmark, and they basically said this couldn't happen. And so they called Albec, and Hans basically said, well, you can't really say no to the king, so we just had to figure out how to do it. And so it really took all of their experience, the material, the techniques, the inventions, and everything kind of working together in order to pull that off. And they did. So the great thing that can come from using natural materials in general is that we know that they're compatible for the most part. There's a long history behind us to show us that they work well together. It's just a matter of knowing how to manipulate them properly. This is the Albec Workshop, where they had lots of folks helping out and working. It's Hans and Sonia's daughter, who is also a very accomplished window craftsperson in Sweden, even today. This was a major project for them. I think their biggest achievement so far is now their products being used on the Château de Versailles in France. So this is for the restoration of, I thought it was 6,000 windows, but I think it might be double that, they said this last time we were over there. If you count all of the buildings on the property and all of the woodwork and so on and so on. The interesting thing about this is that they learned a good lesson here, that sometimes it can be better to do nothing than to do the wrong thing. And this was an 18th century oak window that is in one of the inner courtyards, but that had essentially never been maintained pretty much ever. And it's still in good condition and is totally a candidate for restoration. You would never imagine wanting to throw that out. But on the flip side, after just 1 year of having applied plastic paint to certain surfaces, they're finding this kind of paint failure, but as we saw in previous slides, also wood failure. So better to do nothing than to do the wrong thing. This is an original oak window painted with this little scratch mark here is where they took the sample. That's the original yellow linseed oil paint from 1680, still intact today. And that is the basis off of which they use to make the color Versailles yellow in the Albec palette today, which you could buy at a store near you in Kingston, Ontario. The other thing that they're doing now, and again, this has been a great test terrain for them. They're using the material on wood, but also on metal. Behind the modern paint, the cast iron gatework was basically decaying. And so, and once again, especially at the Château de Versailles, where they keep very good records of things, they just had to go back to what was already working, which was to linseed oil paint. And so finally, for Michael and I think a really amazing accomplishment of theirs is that they were invited to speak at the UN Summit on Climate Change in December 2015 in Paris. And they were invited to speak particularly on the viable use of natural and ecologically sensitive building materials in the larger context, big capital projects and so on and so on. And of course, the connection to Versailles and so on was there. So in our own little Trojan horse way, and we've been setting about trying to do this here in Canada. So in the fall of 2017, we participated in the National Heritage Conference in Ottawa. Hans and Sonia were invited to speak at the conference. But on the panel, our very own Tim Cron, we organized for Tim to be invited. And some of you may know Andrew Paminter. He heads up the Heritage Carpentry program at Algonquin College. He was also there. As we've kind of come through this experience, and the question that we're sort of left noodling around, what will be the heritage buildings of the future? What are the buildings that are going to last that long? What are the buildings that are going to provide inspiration for people in that future time, looking back at a building that was built, say, today, in order to chart their way forward? And our contention is that it's the kinds of buildings that this group is involved in producing, and certainly with these kinds of materials.